Welcome to today's webinar, Smart Growth at 25, toward a more inclusive and resilient smart growth, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Center, National Center for Smart Growth, and the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. This is also the third in a four-part webinar series entitled Smart Growth at 25 with the National Center for Smart Growth, where we will address the history, principles, and implementation of smart growth, discuss what we've learned, identify issues not addressed by the original principles, and talk about where smart growth is going from here. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Smart Growth at 25, toward a more inclusive and resilient smart growth. You may also search for event number 921-9298. Lots of nines in it today. So our speakers today are Arnab Chakrabortym, Willow Lung-Amam, Nikhil Kaza, Robert Goodspeed, and Jeffrey Vincent. Arnab Chakrabortym is a professor of urban and regional planning and associate dean of the College of Fine and Applied Arts at the University of Illinois. His research is focused on the critical questions of housing and infrastructure development and the role of technology in advancing urban analysis and planning. In addition to his academic appointments, Arnab is an editorial board member of the Journal of the American Planning Association and an associate editor of the Journal of Urban Planning and Development. His ongoing projects include mapping urban vulnerability to climate change and using scenario analysis techniques to advance long-range planning. Willow Lung-Amam is an Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Maryland College Park, where she serves as Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education and Director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network. Willow has written extensively on suburban poverty, racial segregation, immigration, gentrification, redevelopment politics, and neighborhood opportunity. She is the author of Trespassers, Asian American and the Battle for Suburbia, and a forthcoming book on redevelopment politics and equitable development organizing in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Nikhil Kaza is a professor of city and regional planning and director for the Center for Urban and Regional Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Nikhil works at the intersection of urbanization patterns, local energy policy, urban analytics, and equity. His research focuses on planning processes in both public and private sectors and the interactions among them. Robert Goodspeed is an Associate Director of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. He teaches and conducts research in the areas of collaborative planning, urban informatics, and scenario planning theory and methods, and is also the author of the book Scenario Planning for Cities and Regions, Managing and Envisioning Uncertain Futures. Finally, Jeffrey Vincent is co-founder and director of public infrastructure initiatives at the Center for Cities and Schools at the University of California at Berkeley. Jeff's policy and research interests lie at the intersection of land use planning, community development, and educational improvement, with a particular focus on how school facilities serve as educational and neighborhood assets. Under Jeff's leadership, the Center for Cities and Schools has worked extensively with local, state, and federal agencies on school facility infrastructure policy issues. Following their presentation, the panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And before we get started, as we usually do now, we're going to open with a poll, just asking where everybody is visiting from today. It's always interesting for us and for the presenters to know where people are coming from today. So you can see on your screen the 5 options: West, Midwest, South, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, or International. And if you need to, you may need to exit from full screen mode to respond to that. And we'll give you all a few seconds to click on your responses, and then we'll share the results and turn it over to Arnab. So thanks for everybody for attending today, and especially those of you who have been through all 3 of these or multiple in the series. We're working on number 4, and we'll be sending out more information about that in the coming week or so, looking at dates in August to finalize our series with a nice panel. So today, 40% Mid-Atlantic Northeast, 21% in the South, 16% both in the Midwest and West, and finally 7% of our audience today is international. And with that, I am going to turn over to Arnab. Welcome, Arnab, and everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to share my screen in just a moment here. I hope you all are able to see my screen now. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Arnab Chakrabortym, and I'm going to speak briefly about today's broad topic: toward a more inclusive and resilient smart growth, which will reflect on how smart growth can engage with issues that the original 10 principles of smart growth missed, and concerns that have gained in prominence since the original 10 principles were articulated. I will also share a quick preview of the relevant sections from our forthcoming handbook on smart growth, on which this webinar series is based. All social movements are products and reflections of the times in which they arise. Smart growth is no different. The attacks on sprawl rose at a time of relative prosperity and social harmony. There were certainly political and social conflicts, but the deep divisions over social justice, public health, and climate change did not arise, at least to this extent that we see today, until well after the turn of the century. For example, although obesity rates in the United States had been rising for decades, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation didn't start the Active Living by Design campaign until 2002. Vice President Al Gore was a vocal warrior in the fight against climate change, but the Paris Accord wasn't signed until 2015. Systemic racism, of course, has been around since Jim Crow and before, but the Black Lives Matter movement wasn't launched until after George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012. Amsterdam formed the digital city in 1994, but IBM didn't launch its $50 billion Smart Cities campaign until 2009. And of course, now we have the pandemic. These events all changed the course of history. And while the principles of smart growth did not change, smart growth advocates and researchers have started to consider what role development patterns have and should play in these changing and rising social issues. In the previous 2 webinars, we discussed lessons from the first 2 sections of our forthcoming handbook. These involved the history of the smart growth movement and what can we say about the influence and implementation of smart growth programs and policies thus far. To quickly summarize, research has shown that indicators such as density, housing and transportation choice, etc., continue in the wrong direction, and that the interest in smart growth as a brand appears to be waning. So, in this 3rd section of the book and in this 3rd panel, we will try to discuss what smart growth missed what impact that may have led to, and what smart growth and where smart growth may need to go next. There are 7 chapters in the handbook that engage distinct questions in these areas, essentially the second half of the forthcoming handbook. And these chapters are grouped by those that deal with social aspects of smart growth, namely public health, gentrification, social equity, and access to opportunity. And those that are focused on the new frontier, namely climate, energy, and technology. 4 chapters among these are represented on our panel today, and we will hear about these directly from the chapter authors in a moment. So let me quickly summarize the 3 chapters from our handbook which could not be included in today's panel. On the topic of public health, Garfinkel Castro and Ewing note that urban planning and public health were both conceived by the need to provide clean drinking water, adequately lit and ventilated housing, access to parks and clean air, and public spaces for social interaction. While the 2 fields grew apart over time, critical issues of public health, the pandemic, physical activity and obesity, traffic accidents, air quality, and mental health have again become recognized as systemically linked to the built environment. On the topic of gentrification, Finio and Knapp suggest that in their zeal to stop urban sprawl, smart growth advocates fail to consider the negative social impacts of redevelopment. They assert that by placing limits on suburban development, smart growth policies can cause the loss of affordable housing and accelerate gentrification and displacement. And finally, Hendricks and Burke explore the relationship between smart growth and climate change, including its potential to both mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change. They find that smart growth can serve as effective, though limited, strategy for addressing climate change, and that many smart growth developments have actually missed the opportunity to mitigate climate risks. Each of these chapters also offers suggestions on how these topics could be more directly included in the pursuit of a smart growth 2.0. Before I turn it over to our panelists to go in detail about their respective chapters and topics, I would like to make a quick note and reinforce what Michael said in his introduction. After today, we'll have one more webinar in this series, which is yet to be scheduled, but is expected at some point in August. This one will be composed primarily of leaders from the field and practitioners, and focused on new opportunities in light of the new federal administration. So without further ado, let me ask Dr. Willow Lung-Amam, Associate Professor at the University of Maryland, to please take it over from here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully everybody can now see my screen. Thank you, Arnab, for the introduction, and of course, for being one of the editors and inviting these phenomenal group of authors on such an important topic. So my chapter is written with co-author Katie June Friesen, a PhD student at the University of Maryland. And our chapter examines the forces that have brought smart growth and equitable development movements together in recent decades, and some of the critical questions and tensions that we believe continue to push them further apart. We draw on established literatures to trace what we call a slow but critical turn in the smart growth movement from a time when some of the concerns facing low-income communities of color and other marginalized groups were largely divorced from questions of smart growth to today, when we see these concerns as more foregrounded. We focus on the growing equitable regional equity planning movement, an area where advocates have forged some common ground and provide a promising bridge between these 2 historically fractured fields. And equity, to be clear, is a topic as sprawling as metropolitan growth itself, so of course we do not purport to do much justice to their complex linkages within one chapter, but rather our point here is to chart how advocates and scholars from within the smart growth movement and those who have tried to push it from its margins have come together around a smart and equitable regional growth agenda in recent years. So in the early smart growth period, we believe evidence distrust that was sometimes felt between traditional smart growth and equitable development advocates that tended to come from different worldviews, have different constituents, and use different tools towards different ends. When smart growth's guiding principles were established, issues of social and economic equity were largely not centered. Smart growth's policies often gave little attention to their impacts on socially and economically marginalized groups, and many smart growth conversations failed to bring these groups to the table. Many equitable development advocates, meanwhile, did not make clear ties between their work and smart growth. Oops, wrong direction. But in recent decades, we've seen that new bridges have been built largely led by community development and equity planners. So by the early 2000s, we have seen scholars and policy leaders that were promoting a regional approach and calling on smart growth and equitable development advocates to foreground the connections between sprawl and urban inequality. They argued that regions were interdependent systems, that segregation and sprawl were costly to entire metropolitan areas, and that the regional level was where the greatest possibilities for equitable planning could be realized. And they began to promote a set of regional equitable growth principles and regions across the country began to take up their call. These are quotes by Robert Bullard, one of the father of environmental justice and one of the early advocates of this regional equitable growth principles and strategies. But we've seen that the bringing together of these allied but sometimes disparate movements under the banner of a regional equitable growth has been neither a smooth nor complete process. So in our chapter, we chart some of these tensions and challenges from within the field. One of those challenges has been to effectively mobilize cross-sector coalitions beyond the local level. The smart growth movement has long recognized that growth policy is often most effective at the regional level, yet land use decisions are controlled locally. The regional equity movement has broadened the geographic scales of efforts that have been traditionally fought within local municipalities and issues that smart growth have traditionally not focused on, such as affordable housing. However, when these coalitions have often coalesced, they have also often had limited success. And here I'm highlighting the Baltimore Opportunity Coalition that came together in 2011 under a $3.5 million grant from the Obama administration's under the Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grant Program, which was really one of a phenomenal opportunity for regions across the United States to do regional equity planning. But what our assessment at the National Center has shown is that after 5 years of planning, the coalition made little progress. There was a lack of regional government authority and local political will, as well as planning silos that left traditional fair housing advocates pushing for change without much support from other coalition members. So what we argue is that state and federal funding is really needed to help push some of these regional equity coalitions, not only to keep them afloat, and that stronger regional governance structures are needed to provide the political leverage they need to shift these long-held metropolitan patterns of racial and economic segregation. Another critical challenge that we talk about in our chapter is this long-standing debate among community development and fair housing advocates as to whether to prioritize opening up new housing opportunities in advantaged, quote-unquote, high opportunity neighborhoods, or to invest in improving conditions in disadvantaged neighborhood. And we argue that the regional equitable growth movement has really inherited and inflamed this debate. In recent years, we've seen the popularity of these neighborhood opportunity frameworks in terms of mapping tools and data, and especially being pushed by regional equity planning advocates. But on the other hand, we've seen the pushback of some community development advocates that have really challenged the kind of dispersal consensus upon which these efforts rely. Here on the screen, you'll see a map from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and if you've seen the traditional maps of opportunity neighborhoods, this is explicitly an attempt to get away from that kind of map and show that neighborhoods have different kinds of opportunities, not some kind of rank order of opportunities that leads to a certain kind of investment in different areas. So smart growth advocates have been largely silent in these debates, but it's a critical issue for regional equity advocates, leading to not only some confusion on their position, but just a need for more engagement around this issue from smart growth. And the final challenge that we chart is that a central tenet of smart growth is to limit sprawl and promote more dense mixed-use development in already urbanized areas, particularly around transit. And as another chapter in this book shows, that in rapidly growing regions, these kind of strategies can exacerbate existing neighborhood inequalities, promote gentrification, and displace lower income residents and businesses and the services upon which they rely. We also show in the chapter how the focus on producing mixed income, mixed use developments that smart growth advocates often cast as diverse and inclusive communities. In fact, some of the evidence shows otherwise. For example, in new urbanist developments that often lack both economic and racial diversity, and in many places have contributed to higher housing prices and displacement. So smart growth advocates, we argue, can help to ensure such neighborhoods support integration and inclusion by thinking beyond land use or simply urban design strategies as a proxy for inclusion. And here I'm offering a photo from the Washington, D.C. suburbs. This is in Langley Park, where the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education and myself have done a lot of work around trying to keep a low-income Latinx community in place in the face of a new light rail corridor that threatens the viability of both residents and businesses, and to put a number of anti-displacement protections in place. So in concluding, for these two movements to continue to strengthen their collaborative endeavors, there really needs to be space for truth-telling and healing among advocates for smart growth that need to acknowledge some of the harms that its practices have really brought to low-income communities of color, and equitable development advocates who still have a sense of distrust over aligning with the smart growth movement. Smart growth advocates need to better integrate racial equity frameworks into their work and think beyond land use to some of the issues that equitable development advocates care about most, especially issues of affordable housing. Coalitions must draw on their diverse expertise, establish shared frameworks, principles, and processes for inclusive conversation, and look to areas of allied concern as a foundation for shared action. These processes must not only define the strategies and actions that work, but also build the political will to achieve them at different scales from the local to the state level. To the extent to which advocates in these traditionally fractured fields can work across their silos and will help to define the next chapter of smart growth. Whereas we argue equitable growth is smart growth and smart growth is equitable. And now I have the pleasure of passing the mic on to Dr. Nikhil Kaza.
Hi, my name is Nikhil Kaza. Can you see my screen, I take it?
Yes, we're just waiting for you to open the PowerPoint.
All right, I'm guessing you're seeing my screen now. So my name is Nikhil Kaza. I'm as been pointed out, at University of North Carolina. But this chapter has been co-authored with a student of mine, Jacob Becker, and this is primarily focused on the issues of energy planning and its relation to smart growth. So we titled this chapter "The Tale of Two Sprawls," primarily because smart growth has been focused on urban.
Nikhil, I just want to break in for a moment, please.
Mm-hmm.
Your view is like in portrait style. We're getting a big black box in the top and the bottoms, and people are not being able to see your full view.
Okay, see if I can break that.
I guess it'll have to work. Nikhil, just move on if you can't resolve it.
Yeah, let's move on. I can't seem to figure out on the fly what's how to fix that. Sorry about that. In any case, the title is "The Tale of Two Sprawls" because since smart growth is focused primarily on urban sprawl, it hasn't been focused too much on the issue of energy sprawl itself. And because energy is a critical infrastructure for urban development, it is something that we figured we need to highlight quite a bit. There are other aspects of energy that I think are important for planners and smart growth advocates to pay attention to, primarily because almost 2/3 of the total energy consumption in the United States is governed by the transportation sector and the building sectors, and that includes both residential and commercial. And it turns out that planners have a lot of influence over these particular sectors, at least in some critically important ways, if not on exact technologies that drive these particular sectors. The other thing that I also wanted to point out in this slide is when you look at the retail electricity sector that is driven by various energy sources, you will see that about 2/3 of the energy that is being consumed by the electricity sector is wasted in some senses, which effectively means that the efficiency of the electricity sector is about 1/3. So every kilowatt hour or BTU that we spend, we require about 3 BTUs of primary energy, whether it is from coal or renewables or wherever, to produce or we extract it from these particular sources, and we only get about a 1 BTU. So anytime we save a BTU, we are effectively saving 3 BTUs of primary energy, and that is something very powerful to keep in mind. Conservation is key in fighting climate change, and smart growth can help us do that. The other bit that I think we need to also pay attention to in this debate is about the role of cities in energy infrastructure, and this is from the IPCC report. And we know that energy infrastructure primarily runs our cities. It includes, as I mentioned before, both transportation and buildings. but also it is also the locus of consumption, energy consumption around the country and around the world. And some important policies around low carbon cities, around efficiency improvements, around retrofits, all these kinds of things can help us sort of reduce our dependence on both fossil fuels, but also reduce our dependence on the total energy that we consume. So cities become a critical part of our energy infrastructure. The way we design our cities, the way we operate them, the way we build them, become crucial to figuring out how to plan for energy systems as well. And the way we build our energy systems also impact the kinds of cities that we are, cities and places that we build. So the first time in 2019, renewables do catch up with coal in the United States, and this is a momentous occasion. But if you look at this particular graph, you will see that large portion of that catching up by renewables is because of biofuels and because of wind. Solar is becoming important, but it turns out that the two main reasons why renewables are becoming more prominent are because of these biofuels and wind. It also turns out that these two particular renewable energy sources are also extensive, very land intensive, and you will see that McDonald and others have demonstrated that energy sprawl is by far the largest driver of land use change in the United States, and it has overtaken urban sprawl. And this is primarily driven by biofuels. Biofuels take up a whole lot of energy, whole lot of land, and a significant amount of water. In part, wind energy also takes up a whole lot of land, though there might be alternative uses that can be designed when we are thinking about wind. But biofuels, on the other hand, take up a whole lot of land, and those become the largest driver of land use change. And that can be seen in this particular graph. As you can see, the conventional fuels are primarily very energy dense, but any renewable fuels are quite energy or land intensive and energy sparse. And so therefore, any transformation of our energy system also means that we will consume more and more resources, especially land, and in some cases water, for this kind of transformation. And any much more significant investment in these renewable energy systems require us to rethink how we are going to use land in a more effective way. So when we are thinking about these things from a smart growth perspective, we have to think about them from both transportation and land use perspective, and how they both interact with our energy systems. And when we think about transportation sector, the first thing that we need to sort of think about is decarbonization of transportation. And then that involves both compact urban form, but also thinking about which transportation modes are more efficient, and how to think about electrification of transport, both in the private transport side and as well as the public transport side. And while electrification is useful, and it's a lot more a lot less land intensive and energy intensive than biofuel based transformation, we also need to think about other kinds of alternative transportation modes that are not as energy intensive, such as bicycles and pedestrian infrastructure. But electrification of transportation sector is coming, and therefore we need to start thinking about how The charging infrastructure is laid out, how it interacts with our parking regulations and other features of our transportation system. The other bit that we are also focused on, or should be focused on, are the issue of what happens with the building energy consumption, and in particular, what happens with building energy consumption in the residential sector. We all know that large houses require large amounts of energy for heating and cooling, but that's only a part of the story. If you look at per square foot basis, single-family residential houses are a lot more efficient than multifamily residential houses, and that has to do with the issue of ownership. That has to do with who reaps the benefit of efficiency upgrades and other kinds of things. So we need to be very careful about what types of housing that we are promoting, how we are providing incentives, how do we deal with the issue of split incentives and other kinds of things. The other bit that we also need to focus quite heavily on, how do we actually design these energy infrastructure, and especially when we are thinking about renewables, and how do we integrate them into our land use planning and water planning processes to some extent in different parts of the world and different parts of the country. And that includes where to site these energy renewable production facilities, what kinds of conflicts they impose on other land uses, the issue of solar rights in different parts of the country, and who has access to those kinds of solar rights and how to protect these solar rights. The other bit that we talk about a little bit in the chapter is how to deal with the issue of microgrids, which are becoming increasingly common in different parts of the world and are touted to be a more sustainable and resilient forms of energy infrastructure. And that plays very nicely with one of the smart growth principles, which is about mixing of land uses that require balancing of different types of energy use in at different times of the day. So there are lots of principles of smart growth that can be readily adapted to emerging forms of energy infrastructure planning, but there needs to be concerted effort to think about these land use, transportation, environment, and energy in a cohesive fashion, rather than thinking about them in their own particular silos by different departments and organizations. And energy ought to become a key way in which or a key lens through which we organize our cities. And that is, I think, what we hope that the new principles of smart growth will accomplish. Well, that's all for me. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it on to Robert.
All right, great. Thank you. How does that look? Thanks to Arnab and the editors of the volume for including me and having some insight into the complete volume. I think it'll become an essential reference, and really look forward to hope you'll join me in adding it to your shelves. So I was invited to contribute a chapter about smart cities and how it relates to the smart growth movement and ideas. And the structure today will loosely follow the structure of the chapter, although in some ways it extends a little bit beyond what's there, and I invite some discussion of these. First, we'll just talk briefly about kind of what the smart city has come to be defined as, a few alternatives, how they relate to smart growth, smart cities in practice. Then we'll kind of pivot and zoom out and say, well, maybe there's broader changes that are occurring in cities somewhat related to this idea of smart urbanism. And then we'll shift towards what the editors suggested, which is implementation areas and some final thoughts for us moving forward. And so to start the chapter, I took a look at a few of the models or definitions that have been proposed for smart cities. And so on the one hand, there's an idea of urban cybernetics exemplified by these big control centers here, the one in Rio. There are these new urban districts, top-down master plan cities that are called smart. And then there's an emerging concept of smart citizenship. And the punchline here is it's seemingly an orthogonal development to smart growth. So a lot of the managerial stuff's very short-term focused. Of course, in the smart growth world, we're looking at long-term land use and infrastructure. The urban districts are master planned, very top-down. We've had a long-standing interest in collaboration, stakeholder involvement as a principle. And finally, smart citizenship is often focused on neoliberal models of citizenship, just providing information. It's not really about reforming public policies or institutions as much as facilitating individuals to interact within them. So it's the first pass here. It's not exactly clear how we're going to make this marriage. Shifting from the literature, the kind of ideal models, to the reality, I wanted to share this slide. So many of you may be aware of smart city programs in different cities. And the one thing they have in common is they're just a totally bewildering variety of concepts and ideas and innovation and, kind of eluding neat definition. And so the example I'm showing is a award-winning project in Columbus, Ohio, the winner of the US DOT Smart City competition. You might have heard about it. And you can see it involves a variety of ideas and technologies that do have some relation to the theoretical models from the earlier slide, but it's a little bit eclectic. And even on the top down, they purport to be participatory and benefit low-income neighborhoods, but in implementation, I think it's been pretty top down, and planning has not been at the table. But there's a longer story there. So the punchline here is, our challenge is we're having real world projects like this that are intervening in cities, and how does this relate to smart growth, and how and in what ways should planners who are trying to promote the smart growth principles or extend them engage with this type of project. And so finally, we come to my final thought, which is perhaps I'm a little bit too zoomed in, and let's maybe zoom out to think about cities and IT in a very macro sense. And so there's a long literature, a lot of folks writing about different utopian notions of what would happen, and there's been a thought for a long time that it would loosen or fundamentally alter urban spatial structure. And I mean, there's a long debate here, but maybe my key takeaway is not as rapid or as dramatic as predicted, and even in a historical moment where we've had mandatory telecommuting across broad swaths of the economy, the downtown is sort of on hold, but it seems to be coming back. And so there's a literature here. There's even an edited volume from 2002 where futurist and architect Bill Mitchell is thinking about electronic cottages and wired neighborhoods, which sort of like, what is a Zoom town? So there are some nuanced, I think, conclusions when you have a lot more folks working at home about land use planning, but it's not like a major new principle, let's say. On the flip side, I mean, the other development that's been unavoidable is the emergence of what I'll call, there's a literature about this, platform urbanism. So a growing number of companies largely that operate through or by technological platforms as part of their business model. And you may be aware of their extensive planning kind of debates, but I like to think about them not in one silo at a time, like the Lyft conversation, the Airbnb regulation conversation, but thinking about how they're all impacting cities simultaneously. And some scholars have pointed out that while we've been debating endlessly about those control rooms, this is the actually existing smart urbanism, the apps in our pockets, which are the way that algorithms and smart technology are already reshaping housing markets and transportation patterns and so forth. And so, all right, so what do we do with all this? I've kind of added a lot of ingredients to a rich stew. Thinking about implementation, where it comes to how do we begin to bring together the smart growth ideas and principles with these trends and ideas. And so, I think the first is engaging to ensure that smart city technologies, let's call them, are reinforcing smart growth. And there's obviously work to be done around telecommuting. So it's not only decentralization and exurban sprawl, it's used in a in a more thoughtful way. Automated vehicles, which are extremely uncertain in some scenarios, very problematic from a land use and transportation viewpoint, but not necessarily. And then finally, equity. And my colleague Willow Lung-Amam, who you heard from earlier, has been involved in some work looking at that topic. And then finally, I have an interest and background in planning support systems and scenario planning. I think also these trends are a mandate to upgrade our own toolkits. And so it includes things like having high resolution land use change mapping. This map here may be unremarkable in Maryland, where you've had for 20 years various sprawl maps, but where I am in Southeast Michigan, sprawl has not been a priority and it has not been mapped. So together with a researcher, we used advanced artificial intelligence algorithms and remotely sensed data, and we could create high resolution data showing the pattern of sprawl. There's also the need to continue data sharing, urban sensing, so track different dimensions of cities we care about and ensure we're upgrading our tools and planning support systems to take advantage of new data and new technology. Kind of concluding thoughts here, there's an article I really enjoyed on City Monitor pointing out, based on some data journalists collected, that smart city kind of projects and hype seem to be declining, and both due to the economic and also other trends in our society. And so I welcome that. The smart city is dead, but long live smart urbanism. So of course, rising in its place are these businesses which they're smart in a way in their use of technology, but they also have particular business models, and for them, data is a critical asset, not necessarily something that they're giving away. And so I'm now focused on all of those systems as key sites for intervention and regulation, but it's hugely challenging because it's police powers at the local level isn't going to cut it, and so therefore we need to look at regulation and intervention at multiple levels of government, and we need to train practitioners and technologists to create more progressive platforms that are based in fundamentally different goals than the ones coming out of Silicon Valley. So just a teaser of some things I've been thinking about lately. At any rate, here's my email. I look forward to the Q&A. Thanks for joining us. Next, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jeff Vincent.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robert. Hopefully that's going to work. Let's see. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and nice to be sort of wrapping this up here. I want to thank my two colleagues at the University of Maryland, Ariel and Jonathan, for working on this and roping me into it. And as many of you know, quote unquote, good schools are something smart growth proponents point to as an essential or important community element, right? It's sort of mentioned, but as we describe in the chapter, the field really has mixed success in forging concrete connections or outlining more pragmatic policy or design approaches that link the two. And I think this is a really important and doable frontier, and we try to make the case in the paper. But I think it's in part, I think, because smart growth really hasn't tackled head-on the racialized politics of place, and of course embedded in that in the United States of America is the racialized politics of local public education. And so moving forward, the smart growth field can and really should kind of better elevate the interconnections between education, public schools, and workforce development with smart growth. And so to build a much needed body of knowledge, but also I think very practical policy guidance. I can imagine folks on this call are kind of like, if you're planners, you're like, wow, I've really been trying to connect to my local school districts, and it's hard for me to get them to even return my calls. So today I want to touch on a few of the things that we point out in the chapter, which I think are especially relevant. The first thing is that, there's a good hook for smart growth advocates because the education field has had what I would consider a very beneficial shift. And that is from obsessing over the achievement gap, right, which is about outputs and test scores, et cetera, to looking at the opportunity gap, right? That is the inputs of education that ultimately affect test scores and graduation rates, et cetera. Those are things like health, nutrition, neighborhood condition, et cetera. And those start to play in the world of planners and smart growth advocates, right? And so I think that this shift in the education field enables a smart growth field to sort of, interact with school districts, interact with educators more. When you think about the opportunity gap, it sort of has existed alongside what some planners have been talking about for a number of years now, which is kind of the geography of opportunity, right? There's sort of, how do you create places and relationships that create opportunity for individuals? And I think, in the school context, a straightforward example would be, a high school student in a low opportunity area cannot get an internship in a high opportunity area without transportation access, right? Transportation is in, planners and smart growthers realm. So in the chapter, we talk about kind of the history of metropolitan areas and schools, and really from a smart growth lens. And we talk about school and housing segregation. We look at schools as physical and social infrastructure in communities, and then we look at the workforce development pipeline. And really today, I just want to make a few comments on the first two bullets there. Schools and housing. I'm sure folks have read a ton on this or thought about it a lot, even in their own communities. I mean, the empirical literature is very clear. We know that school district boundaries affect neighborhood desirability and thus housing prices. And this is even true for people who don't have kids. And of course, the same is true for school assignment boundaries, right? Which school you can go into based on what street you live on. And many people vote with their feet to get access to better schools and school districts. And this really was especially true in the post-World War II period as the suburbs were being rapidly created. The suburbs were sort of sold on enticing people to escape urban ills, right? So the pull of the suburbs, of course, was fraught with outright racism. Where you had white flight and families with more resources fleeing to suburban areas. And as a result, today what you see when you look at most metropolitan areas in the country is you see dozens or sometimes even hundreds of separate school districts, right? And those arose in that time to sort of wall off certain families within certain communities and within certain schools. But in short, sprawl, smart growth's, I guess, key nemesis, has always been a problem of sort of suburban pulls and urban pushes. And, sort of good schools, bad schools has always been a key implicit or explicit piece of that equation. And of course, racism is deeply embedded in that. And there was a really important, and it's such a good article written on this in 2004 by Howie Baum in JAPA, Journal of the American Planning Association, which I'd highly recommend. Smart Growth and School Reform. What if we talked about race and took community seriously, which I thought was just kind of ahead of its time and really putting a stake in the ground on what was going on here. But let's look at schools as kind of place-based physical infrastructure, because I think, planners can kind of see that as a little more tangible. The built form of schools. They're peppered throughout communities across the country. And I think, planners are really always surprised by the sheer scale of our public school system. 1 in 6 Americans sets foot in school every day. They are, there's like 2 million acres of land across the country. And, around 800 billion gross square feet of building, which is about half the building square footage of the entire commercial building sector in the US. Its scale is massive. And one big thread in the smart growth literature, in the late 90s and early 2000s was around kind of school sprawl, right? Looking at where new school construction was happening, where schools were being sited, how that related to surrounding land development, and particularly travel to school. And what researchers saw quite clearly was walking and biking to school plummeted while auto trips to school grew. And, sort of a pinnacle piece in that work was in, I think it was 2011, the EPA released school siting guidelines to local districts and to states, really to create a framework of how you connect school siting and kind of capital infrastructure decisions in schools to kind of anti-small or sprawl or smart growth, thoughts. And so, I think despite this good work, it really hasn't permeated into state policies around school land use. And I think this is really work to be done. And just to give you all a sense of like the kind of dollars we're talking about in terms of fixed infrastructure in this country. If you look at public capital outlay each year across the country, local, state, and federal dollars. Everyone knows that the number one, the largest bundle of that is highways, right? Everybody kind of knows that. But I would be surprised if folks would guess what the second is. And the second is K-12 public schools. It's school construction, it's school modernization. This is the brick and mortar, the capital investment of our public school system. And I think this kind of flies under the radar, and we're getting ready to come out with some analysis on new school siting, in California over the last decade, which is around 300 new schools. Looking at their where they went in relationship to kind of what we might consider kind of smart growth outcomes, such as walkability, for example. So we find that only 43% of these 300 or so schools are cited in areas that the EPA defines as walkable in their walkability index. So you can see there's some room for improvement, right? But of course, you've got education choice. That is where families can kind of choose where to go to school. And so, of course, this introduces like a major tension between where you live and where you go to school, right? You may not always choose to go to the school near you that you could walk to. So, all of this to say that it really matters where the fixed infrastructure of our public school goes. And so some of you are no doubt watching the federal infrastructure package debate, which is raging right now. It's like changes moment to moment, exactly what's included in it and at what level it's going to be funded at. But I don't know if you've noticed that schools have been in it, and there's been a real push to get the federal government to help fix school buildings up. From a resiliency perspective, from just an education equity perspective, and kind of even getting technology and or broadband rather in all of our schools. So it remains to be seen if that will stay in. But I'll end with these kind of two images, I guess, for those of us that are kind of smart growth advocates or thinkers anyway. Smart growth spent many years trying to avoid outcomes like the top picture. That is a new school built on a green field, sort of leapfrogging other development, or coming ahead of development, which you can see in this one. We've got some nice cul-de-sacs clearly coming online sometime soon. Whether or not the school built the infrastructure that enabled that development to go there is a whole nother question, but some of you, I'm sure, have stories of this. But I think that, at least one new frontier for the field to get active in is illustrated by the bottom image, right? It's kind of a, let's fix it first, or let's fix what we have. Let's remake our existing places. And I think schools are, the physical aspect of schools is central to that. For equity, for communities, for resilience, et cetera, but of course, times have changed. It's not the post-war suburban boom. It is, times of cities are changing. People are moving back into cities and lots of gentrification is happening. What does that mean for our school campuses? So how they should look and how they should function, I think, is a big question for smart growth advocates. That smart growth advocates should weigh in on over the next decade. So with that, I'll wrap up and I'll turn us back to a larger discussion. I'm kind of curious people's thoughts on this, even how it relates to smart cities and other things about community development. So with that, I'll open up to turn it back over maybe to you, Arnab, on Q&A.
Thanks, Jeff. I think Michael will moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Arnab, and thanks, Jeff. Actually, we've been having some conversations about inviting you, Jeff, on a specific webinar about school siting. It's one of our possible topics, so we may want to revisit that with you. So at this point, I'll ask our panelists to go ahead and turn their cameras on so you can see them. And thanks to everybody for submitting a question today. You can continue to submit them through the questions tab, and we'll go through here for about the next half an hour or so. And I appreciate everybody's conversation today. Okay, so I'll start with this one. Actually just came in here for Willow, who's asking, can you point to a place where a community displaced by transit or LRT development was able to be properly rehoused instead of being abandoned?
Oh, that's a great question. So I can't exactly point to a great example. Well, yeah, I can. So in Washington, D.C., in Columbia Heights, around the new metro redevelopment, is where a significant portion of affordable housing was able to be preserved. And the reason why it was able to be preserved was because of the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act, which allows tenants to organize to be able to purchase the building when it goes up for sale and have the first right of refusal to be able to purchase the building at a market price. And why the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act has worked so well in the face of gentrification in DC is first because it was in place long before the current affordable housing crisis in DC, right? Oftentimes the tools we need are built in a former stage of advocacy with a former housing crisis and are effective in the next wave of the housing crisis, and so it was in place. But also DC had a significant amount of funds in order to be able to help tenants to enact that right, including funds to help support organizers to make those tenants' rights real. So it's not just enough to have policies in place, and in many places like the Purple Line Corridor Coalition, we're still building those policy tools, but then you also have to have the funding and the organizing behind that to make them real and effective.
Great, thanks, Willow. And we'll, if any of the other panelists want to add, you can always jump in afterwards. And we may be jumping around a little bit given the breadth of topics that we covered today. So just warning everybody here, both on the panel and in the audience. I guess the next question is actually for Jeff regarding school facilities, which is what are your thoughts regarding repurposing school facilities as multi-purpose 24/7 community facilities to minimize the negative impacts of their footprint?
Yeah, I think in some ways that, what is the future public school? I mean, my personal opinion is that it's more likely to be, well, probably denser, but also mixed use. And that is, more around the clock use and by other users. Of course, we've done a lot of work on this. Like logistically, this is very difficult, right? And safety of children and not interacting with other adults is certainly a paramount concern to folks. But there are some really good examples across the country of cities, school districts mainly working with cities and sometimes developers as well to sort of make these mixed use campuses. There's a really fantastic one here next to Berkeley in the little city of Emeryville, where they did kind of a community center school, and it has city services and the school as well. But I think this is the future. I think a mixed use as well with housing is really interesting. Willow mentioned Columbia Heights in DC. There's an amazing a school right near there, the Oyster Bilingual School, which is a handful of blocks from that area, which was done as a renovated as a public-private partnership and housing done on part of the land. And in part, the school could sort of forego some of the field space that they had in return for the developer renovating what was an extremely dilapidated school. So I think there's these really interesting partnerships and mixed uses potential, which is really a new frontier, frankly.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Next question here is from Sarah Gay, who notes that her questions remain the same as from session 1, which is how do we get city administrations, for example, the real practitioners, to move their thinking to the point of being willing to limit what developers can do in their city for encouraging infill development or vacant strips over clearing and paving green space on the fringes, for example. The latter is becoming rampant in the small city of Concord, North Carolina, as pressure from neighboring Charlotte's growth arrives here. So we're seeing big swaths of forest being cleared, hastening warming, etc. The political will is always the issue of how. So how can we get this moving? I don't know who wants to take that one on to start.
Well, I'll offer a brief comment. Although I got master's at Maryland, learned about smart growth in grad school, I've been out here in Michigan for 8 years, and definitely most of the country never was on board with the smart growth movement. And there's, most states never passed any state level smart growth laws or frameworks, and in addition to those that have watered them down or rescinded them. So I think your all you're doing is pointing out that even on the original principles, it's been a political challenge in many places, and the effect of our section of the book is to pile on a confusing array of additional issues that are just, that then there's only so much time and energy to focus policy conversations. So I don't have an answer other than I'm glad you raised it, and it points out the importance of the political angle. And maybe just my own little minor role is there has been some nascent and in the past concerns about what we're doing to our state's land, and the rhetoric that I heard is there's only so many million acres of land that are God created in Michigan, and there's not making any more, so we should got to steward it better. But we're starting at a very low place, and hence my purely descriptive study to even quantify sprawl, because there's been no interest in even among the planners in doing that kind of mapping and analysis. So maybe I'll come back in a decade and have an answer, but we all have to work at tackling it in different angles.
I could add quickly to Rob's note there. Not sure if this is totally along the smart growth lines. I think the part of it along the smart growth lines would be to keep redevelopment options easier than what's been in the past, remove the barriers to redevelopment, making it predictable, having the data and the regulations in place. But the part that goes beyond smart growth perhaps is having plans for your greenfield areas. I think there's a tendency to, once you go out of existing urbanized area or municipal boundary, all bets are off, you can develop wherever you want. But having some plans regarding how that development happens could make that development organized, if not redirected towards infill areas. I can't give you a great example of that off the top of my head. I live in Champaign, Illinois, a smaller university community in central Illinois. And when a new interchange came in here about 15 years ago, the city got ahead of the development and came up with a plan for the surrounding area to have regulations regarding sidewalk, minimum lot size development, cluster development, PUDs, etc. And to some extent, the development in that area has been planned, although I don't know if I can say the same about the other surrounding areas of the town.
Thanks, Arnab.
A small example from Baltimore. So I featured the Baltimore Opportunity Coalition's work to develop a regional plan that was really about increasing opportunity to some of the lower income, high poverty neighborhoods in Baltimore through the regional planning processes. But and sort of working across silos, bringing all parties to the table, bringing politicians to the table, bringing business leaders to the table, and really starting from a point trying to break through traditional silos. Those silos sort of happened as soon as the working group and planning began. So there wasn't really an effort to sort of cross-pollinate as the planning process went forward. Many of the political leaders dropped out of the process or were never engaged in the process. Many business leaders did too. But some of the more effective plans that happened were those that really did work across the silos. So those that were about taking a transportation plan and making it about affordable housing and workforce development, helping people get from their neighborhoods where there were not jobs to the suburbs where there were jobs, helping people to locate more affordable housing across the region through the transportation planning, which is actually at the regional level where we do have some power and some governance structures still in place. And the other thing is not just looking locally, because of course all the local municipalities who never wanted affordable housing were not on board to put additional affordable housing inside their neighborhood. And Baltimore County, which has historically been really reluctant to do source of income discrimination legislation, even though they've been brought to court over their discrimination policies. It eventually happened in Baltimore County, but it happened because the push happened from the state level, and state level actors got involved. And so when we're thinking about building coalitions and advocacy, we have to be thinking beyond the local level as well.
can't resist Willow's excellent points about collaboration. Makes me think, of course, the use of scenarios as a methodology for collaboration deliberation has been hugely important. And the trend scenario, even for the free market right winger, they're often very unhappy with the congestion and the pollution and all the other stuff you can spit out of your GIS. And then hopefully it leads to this conversation about what should change, and you avoid triggering terms like smart growth, but you're actually talking about it.
Thanks, Robert. Actually, Sarah did point out in a comment afterward, she's just wondering and hoping that this issue of policy matters are included in your book. So she's looking forward to that issue being discussed further when your book comes out next year, all of you. Next question here is from Hannah Twaddle, who's saying, and I guess this is a question for Jeff, I remember a lot of excitement among planners about updated school siting standards that encourage smaller footprints and infill design strategies. For example, sharing community libraries with the school library instead of having two separate buildings. The organization that most schools use as a reference for their local standards. Do you have any insights or updates on how widely those have been adopted?
Yeah, not very much actually. A lot of the state, there was a professional organization of school facility planners that sort of emerged out of, this is like a micro subset of the urban planning universe, if you will, right? Of which I would encourage all of our universities to start replanning people going into that field. But anyway, they came up with these sort of guidelines, which were 10 acres for elementary schools, 20 to 30 acres for middle schools, and 40 to 50 for high schools, right? And it was sort of based on a sort of suburban kind of model of lots of fields and all the stuff, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, everyone wants to have fields to play and everything, but those basically got sort of written as, in pen, right, as those were the rules. And so most states point to those and still do, or at least mention them and recommend them if they don't necessarily quote unquote require them, or require you to get exemption from them rather, right? So, I think the EPA and some of the advocates that was working with EPA about a decade ago did do some chiseling away with that to give a little more flexibility. But I think those sizes and the functionality of which a school can operate within those kind of acreages is sort of still ingrained in the school planning world. So you're differentiating from the norm if you're doing anything, God forbid, smaller, right? And so it has not gotten as much traction as advocates would like. We have looked at California. In California in particular, the sites, I mean, they tend to be a little smaller than the recommended sizes, but not that much. So there's a long way to go on that.
Thanks, Jeff. Actually, what we're doing here in Maryland with the Interagency Commission on School Construction is what's led for some of our internal conversations about having a couple of school siting and related webinars. So stay tuned for that. We may be able to pull something together soon. Next question here is for Nikhil, which is from Jennifer Judd, who asks, the term energy sprawl is new to me, and I appreciated learning more about the issue and topic. Can you share some examples of innovative mixed use for energy sources and development sites?
Yeah, so energy sprawl has been a sort of point of contention, or rather has been in vogue since, let's say, 2010 or so. So relatively recent term, but primarily focused on the issue of renewables becoming more and more prominent. And because renewables are energy, they're not energy dense, they require large amounts of land to operate in. But it's not uniquely to renewables, right? So there are the conventional renewables like hydropower and other kinds of things also required significant amounts of land transformation, whereas the newer renewables such as photovoltaics and wind energy take some as well. So with regards to sort of the mixture of uses in how we can plan better to integrate this energy infrastructure. There are lots of examples, primarily in Europe, but also in other parts of the world where there are community solar and other kinds of microgrids that are focused on neighborhoods that also include energy infrastructure built in within those neighborhoods that you can think of as mixing both energy infrastructure as well as housing and other infrastructure that we need. There are other cases where agricultural uses have been mixed with wind power, where it is easier to operate certain large machinery with the spaces that are available that you need for the wind turbines. There are obviously concerns of mixing some energy infrastructure, especially production infrastructure, with other residential uses because of either visual clutter or noise or other kinds of things. But it all depends on where you are and what scale at which we are producing this energy, and then how well the community accepts these production facilities.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to some bigger picture questions here. So I think we're all been grappling with. And first one here is from Rick Nino, who is saying, the speakers all seem to indicate that the term smart growth is on the wane among analysts and researchers, but the smart growth field is still used by many organizations as a term. Would you suggest a better term for those groups to use as a label for their work? Because that's kind of the theme of this webinar series.
Well, I can take the first stab at that. I'm not sure I have a better term. As if you followed the previous webinars, and I think in this one as well, we've used the term Smart Growth 2.0. That's largely a reflection of the need for perhaps rebranding and reimagining the package of the big umbrella of topics that the Smart Growth typically contains or reflects. But we haven't really, come up with anything. I would admit that we have thought about it a bit, but I would admit also that we haven't come up with anything that we felt was compelling. I think, the challenge really has been to reimagine what's considered good practices. And really for the time that when these principles were articulated, for some of the things I mentioned earlier, this was a good package. It basically said that communities are not really they don't really always have the choice to say, not where to grow or where not to go, but how to grow, and regulating and to a large extent incentivizing areas such as existing infrastructure areas from receiving such development. And over time, it's the interest waning is the correct observation. As we showed in one of the past presentations, the articles that use the term smart growth in national media has been falling. The Google search for terms like smart growth have been falling. Of course, this is not a conclusive research, but and we can make some speculative correlations about the terms that have been rising. We didn't do that research very systematically. But I think we'll see that, social equity, sustainable development, climate resilience, those terms have been on the upswing. And to a large extent, fairly or not, a lot of folks see them as a reincarnation or a different collection of ideas that are worth pursuing. So for smart growth to sort of survive and endure in the future, it needs to actively engage some of these ideas very squarely and center them. Whether there's a term that can do that appropriately, I don't know. I don't really have a direct answer again, but those are some of the things we've wondered about when thinking about what term we could use.
Okay. I guess kind of a related question here is from Daniel Savard, who's asking, is there a difference between Smart Growth 2.0 and integrated planning?
Let me take a stab at that, if not directly to answer that question. I want to sort of make the case that most of the principles that that smart growth advocates and other types of concepts that people talk about, resilience, sustainability, and other kinds of things, there's a lot of overlap among these, and as Arnab pointed out, sometimes maybe old wine in new bottles kind of a situation. But it is important to sort of pay attention, not maybe to the labels, but to the collection of ideas that that they foreground. And I think one of the things I think this particular panel had tried to do would be to see, especially in the smart growth realm, what ideas have not been foregrounded and should be foregrounded. So in that sense, you know, it doesn't, to some extent, it doesn't matter which term you use largely, except maybe from a shorthand perspective. But I think what matters really is like what issues are we considering and how are we considering them in our planning processes. And if it turns out that one term is better for one particular audience, I think we should just go ahead and use that.
Yeah, I think, you know, yeah, I like those comments. I mean, I thought a lot about this as well, because I don't hear in California, I don't hear that term a lot. You know, Arnab, you mentioned some of the terms that are used, right? Or even resiliency, you know, social justice. And, you know, it's like, I do think that the question is a good one originally posed, because I feel from like a organizing perspective, we need a big tent, right? And maybe this is just semantics, but I think that we need a big tent of what people are talking about, because whether you're sort of driven by, you know, you're super interested in bird-safe glass in buildings, or you're super interested in energy expenditure or walkability. I mean, my guess is that folks across those various spectrums have more in common as a shared agenda from a development perspective than they have not in common. And so from a sort of policy and structural change perspective, whether you're talking about like a city, a regional agency, or even the state, you need those coalitions to move things, right? I mean, you know, someone mentioned the work in Maryland on school siting. Like, yeah, on paper it looks amazing, but I know some of the people who work in there, and they're like, yeah, it kind of stops there in terms of what we're able to do, which is not a critique to them. It's like, it's really hard to do. But anyway, my point is, I think we collectively do need a sort of big tent. I don't know what the name is, I don't know what the frame is, but it's sort of like more that unites people rather than fractures people into like, oh, I'm interested in social justice, but that doesn't mean I'm not interested in environmental sustainability, or it's, you know, vice versa. So it's like, how do we bring it together to sort of move the 2.0 forward, I think.
I'm gonna agree with Jeff a little bit here. So at the National Smart Growth Center, we've been having discussions about whether we should change the name of the center or whether this legacy is really important. And many people have said, no, let's just rethink the idea. Let's use this as an opportunity for a 2.0 version and really critiquing ourselves and the underlying principles and what's missing. And I think that's the push behind this conversation. But I also think that words really matter. They matter in terms of, you know, the goal, right? And when we think about the word smart and we think about the word growth, it's sort of the inevitability of growth. The growth is good model. It's also, there's this idea that we can sort of encapsulate what we mean by smart, right? I mean, it's kind of the smart cities conversation. And so I'm curious about Rob's take on that term, but as opposed to resilient and inclusive communities, which I'm a big fan of the term communities, because we're not just trying to build cities, we're not just urban, we're not just talking about urbanism, we're really talking about how to make better communities. And so I think those a collective sense of the goal is encapsulated a bit in the term itself. And so I think we really, in rethinking our use of terminology, are rethinking the possibility for coalition and organizing, but also thinking what's sort of the future or the outcome that we're looking for.
Great, thanks, Willow. I know we're getting close to the end here. We'll have a couple more questions and we'll do a wrap up. We did get a couple questions about how the book addresses the issue of public health and the social determinants of health. And I know that's been a conversation a lot of planners have been having recently. I guess curious about how you're going to be tackling it.
I can respond to it quickly. There is a chapter written by Andrea Garfinkel-Castro and Reed Ewing of the University of Utah, and that looks at both the history of smart growth and public health and how they kind of have a lot of parallels, and not just smart growth, but planning in general, like I said, because of both of these disciplines and fields' interest in clean water and good living environments. But over time, planning, as they analyze it, the authors analyze it, have gotten more focused on built environment, and public health have gotten more focused on individuals and behavior. But over time, we're seeing more convergence in those authors' analysis and greater recognition, in part supported by research on physical activity and obesity and traffic accidents and mental health, and how a lot of these relate to communities as well as to the living environments that are oftentimes influenced by planners. So in this chapter, those authors analyze the relationships among these issues and then propose some ways to target them and tackle them together and better.
Okay, thanks. I guess I wanted to combine two comments and questions because they were just responding to the conversation we were having a minute or so ago about what smart growth means. And one is from Andrew Wilson, who says, is sustainable urbanism the evolution of smart growth? Perhaps there's a concern related to the use of the term growth, which for some may have negative connotations related to a preoccupation with economic growth. And another one here from David Gregg, who says, surely the branding should be in terms of how the public understands how we are to survive as a species. As we speak about these issues, it is in our own vocabulary, not of that of the public. So just a couple of comments there. Maybe you want to respond to.
I'll share a quick thought to kind of join the branding roundtable, because one of the participants who knows me just sent me a personal email saying, "What's the difference between smart growth, smart cities, and smart urbanism?" So I think of planning as animated by multiple and rival normative ideals and systems. I think the two most salient are sustainability and resilience, and increasingly resilience more than sustainability, I think, due to a cynicism and pessimism about the ideal of sustainability. And smart growth has been sort of somewhere in the wings with new urbanism, and so, but I think, you know, the question I got in email speaks to, I view it as a useful reservoir of like ideas, but I view it as very limited. You know, that's why we're in this section. The original rubric didn't even have racial equity, as Arnab pointed out. So it's, even today, those original principles are like a little stale. And so, but I think I'm hopeful this book or the conversation can breathe some new life in it. But at the end, due to the emergence of these new terms and the fundamental original ambiguity that Willow points out about in assumptions, you know, maybe smart growth hasn't been worked in the Rust Belt. We have shrinking cities, so it's hard to walk in the door and start talking about a growth model where they're like, well, we're just trying to redevelop, like, what, you know. So I think I view it kind of more in that layer of like a resource, a set of ideas, this, you know, this set of debates that I can draw upon, but then is no longer a politically relevant you know, term. I'm not going to go to Lansing and try to sell smart growth, but maybe in 1994 I would have. But you know, it's, the world's moved on and it's a more complex conversation. And but the principles remain relevant, suitably amended by any of these or others from our book that you like, or you know, that you feel is needed.
So does smart urbanism include smart ruralism? Or is that an entirely
Well,
different
I mean,
topic?
I can attempt to clarify. I mean, I tried to explain smart cities. It's like, what is a high-tech city, a normative vision of a high-tech city kind of
Yeah.
created by technologists ignorant of our literature or ideas. And the shift towards smart urbanism is trying to point out that technology is already diffuse, and then therefore, it's a kind of diffuse phenomenon. It's not normative, it's just the reality. We all have smartphones, we use technologies every day, try to understand the impact. So, but again, we're tripping over all these different terms, which is a big red flag when it comes to convincing your elected official of anything. So, where that's my thought, the conversation starts in a scenario world where you're not privileging any particular discourse, you're looking at the concrete issues and concerns and debates, drawing on literatures as needed.
Yeah. I mean, in my mind, the growth is the word to think about, because what I see emerging, and I actually sit on the planning commission for a city here, and what I see emerging is two fractions, sort of, which people who are very pro kind of growth, and that's usually like infill, et cetera, and then there's people that are very anti-growth. So, the sort of, people call it a sort of NIMBY versus a YIMBY debate, which is sort of playing out all over the place. But in part, the one side of that is actually calling into question the whole role of, say, cities and planners of having legitimacy to, do integrated planning or whatever, even talk about sustainability or invest money in it. And I think that's fascinating for a smart growth 2.0, or whatever we're calling it 2.0.
The YIMBYs have conferences now. So on that note, perhaps it was inevitable that term be used, and with that we will end before we John put on the note for a follow-up session.
Yeah, so we will have session 4 coming up in August, hopefully, if not September, trying to finalize the date. We've also been having conversation with the Smart Growth Network about how to continue this conversation and discussion through the network itself, and opportunities for folks to participate in it more directly than through watching a webinar. So keep an eye out on that as well. So we'll go ahead and wrap up, and I'll just give everybody a minute or so to give us some final thoughts and takeaways, and we'll start with Jeff.
Well, I thought this was good. I mean, I appreciate the focus on it, and I appreciate kind of the new era. As I was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed grad student, I was drinking the Kool-Aid of smart growth, and it's really interesting to reflect on where it is now, particularly as people aren't fleeing to the suburbs per se. They're moving back into cities, or they're staying in cities, and they want options. Particularly people with children, and that's something that we've been playing around with. Fewer people are having children on the whole. But those that don't necessarily want to do what my parents did, which was, move to the outskirts. They want to have walkability, and they want to have transit access, and they want to have downtowns. And you see that. That's why all the little, old neighborhoods around Washington, D.C., for example, are extremely pricey, right? Because it's sort of that mix of sort of some trees and some yard with a sort of some density. And it's really fascinating to see that. That sort of change in what families want as they're going forward. And I think the question about remaking schools and campuses is to be sort of mixed use and other uses, I think is just phenomenal, whether they're in one for us to tackle, whether they're as stormwater runoff places throughout cities, or places where retired folks can go and give lessons on World War II or something, and get email training and response. I think this is really exciting, and really micro and local level as well. So thank you all.
Thanks. Robert, do you want to add more?
I'll just brief note that I often explain scenario planning is motivated either by a desire for transformation, like smart growth or new urbanist movements, or resilience. But when you're doing a resilience plan, you can't avoid the normative questions of what is the community that you're trying to create or promote. So I think, that's, reiterate my earlier comments, smart growth and the related ideas remain relevant within this volume, and this debate is really needed to update it and expand it to include new different dimensions.
Great, thank you. Nikhil?
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to mention is we haven't talked a whole lot about it in this particular session, but I think it's increasingly relevant is the interconnectedness of various systems, infrastructure, but also social systems, especially in the context of changing climate and other issues. And when we think about energy infrastructure, for example, we think about it as is a standalone system that we have. But we know that it is connected with our water infrastructure. We know that it is connected to the demands from agriculture and urban systems and others. So we do want to think sort of more cohesively and cohesively about these issues, and then think about how to plan for them in the future, where more extreme events and demands are going to be commonplace. So, and that's where Rob's work on scenario planning might play a role. So,
Willow.
Yeah, so this has been a great conversation. Thank you to the organizers. I'll just say that I started off in planning at a very different place than Jeff. Went to the University of Maryland, the capital of smart growth, and the home of the National Smart Growth Center, and felt very alienated by the kind of issues that the center and the larger smart growth world was talking about. So I was not at all interested in smart growth, and never imagined that I would come back one day and be a part of the Smart Growth Center. But it was because of the issues and communities that I cared about most were not centered in the kind of conversations around what we were having and calling smart growth at that time. And so the issues in this volume are absolutely critical to really thinking about what the future of smart growth is and how you bring more people into the conversation and into the fold in ways that matters to them.
Great, thank you. And we'll let Arnab finish today.
Oh, I'll just thank all of you, especially Rob, Jeff, Willow, and Nikhil for joining us today, and for all of your hard work and your co-authors for the chapters. And thank you, Jeff and Michael, for coordinating and organizing this. I think this has been very helpful. And the book is still finishing up. It will be available early next year, hopefully. So stay tuned for that. And if you're engaged in this, as I'm sure all of you are, get in touch if you have any questions, suggestions, and we'd be happy to follow up with you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and thanks everyone. This will conclude our webinar today, Smart Growth at 25, toward a more inclusive and resilient smart growth. Offer a great big thank you to our panelists for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email, especially if you need it to claim credits for some other organization. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including the fourth and final session of Smart Growth 25 series. Have a great day.